Hello, here today in the German Tier 8 premium battleship, Tirpitz. We're in a Tier 10 game, so we're bottom tier on the map Northern Lights, also known as North, and the mode is Domination. So Tirpitz is one of the oldest premiums in the game, a pretty stalwart premium, good economy, pretty good performance, but her reputation suffers because a lot of, shall we say, less skilled players do end up picking her up and playing her without the necessary experience because of her history and because of her reputation as a close-in brawler and relatively beginner-friendly ship because of the German character of being big tanky battleships. Now, compared to her tech tree sister, the Tirpitz has a smidge more health due to her higher displacement, is about half a knot faster, but she differs in her consumable setup. You'll notice here she does not have the hydro of the Bismarck, but in exchange she does receive a pair of torpedo tubes. These are quad tubes mounted in the midsection on either side. You can see them here. They have a 6-kilometer range, and I do 13,700 in torpedo alpha, which makes them a potent close-in weapon which can cripple a battleship or outright kill a destroyer or cruiser. Like the Tirpitz, or like the Bismarck rather, the Tirpitz is held back by her rather poor accuracy. She has the German dispersion formula, which is essentially the least accurate in the game at ranges above 8 kilometers, and even at 8 kilometers and below, it's not the greatest. This is coupled with the universal German battleship sigma of 1.8, shared by all German battleships with the exception of the Scharnhorst with her small caliber rifles. And lastly, she has the compounding problem of only 8 rifles in the caliber of 380 millimeters. So these are very small caliber rifles for a tier 8 battleship, and she has very few of them. Add to that the fact that they're very well spaced out due to the size of the Tirpitz. The Tirpitz is an extremely large battleship. And the fact that the German twin turret is relatively well spaced out in terms of barrels. You can see the barrels are actually quite a distance apart, and you get an inaccurate main battery. So as a result of this rather mediocre main battery, the Tirpitz and her sister Bismarck do end up getting specced into secondaries a lot. So I have a hybrid secondary spec. So I have 9.4 kilometers of secondary range rather than the typical 11.3, and this is because I prefer to take extra tank skills as opposed to secondary skills. Even with manual secondaries, which I do have, secondaries are not particularly accurate at your maximum range of 11.3. Not unless you're a Massachusetts or Georgia, or the upcoming Ohio currently in Super Test anyway. So I feel personally that the extra 2 kilometers of range isn't exactly a big deal. So in exchange I have fire prevention. Now this is a 14-point captain, so I am missing some of my skills, but 14 is more than enough to suffice. So, lacking concealment expert, you'll see that the Tirpitz Bismarck has a rather large 14.3 detection. It's not the worst in the world, but definitely amongst the worst at her tier, outside of the Key and Amagi, which are absolutely horrendous. However, the Key and Amagi both do pretty much take concealment expert all the time, so in practice you will find that outside of secondary spec Massachusetts, you will be the least stealthy battleship at the tier. Now I'm playing very cautiously. This is a tier 10 game after all, just looking for broadside. This Conqueror is a perfect first target to look at. This is a pretty good salvo for a Bismarck Tirpitz. Nice and tight, it looks almost American. However, they all do fall short, unfortunately. Due to poor dispersion, the Conqueror is slowly reversing those, so I'll have plenty of time to take a second salvo. Now I was saying the 380mm battleship rifles are pretty low caliber for this tier, but against full broadside targets, they do retain sufficient penetration. You can see here much uglier salvo. More on target though, so full broadside Conqueror, pretty large target at 14 kilometers and still only landed 2 shells. One of them even over penetrates from hitting the uppercase mate. As I increase the range, this accuracy will only decrease. You can see the Massachusetts, who does have AFT, popping off of his secondaries. Gonna take a shot there. Let's see how this looks. Pretty clean salvo. Again, I was expecting him to accelerate, but it looks like he's just continued to decelerate, even though I can't see his smokestack anymore. Did manage to skim him for another 6k though, so not the worst in the world. I'm gonna maintain my angle, but you'll notice the Bismarck Tirpitz has a pretty bad gun angle. This is my backward angle. I could take a little more angle. This should be about my limit though, and you'll see I'm still giving a fair amount of broadside. Any battleship or cruiser can easily get full AP pens here on you. Alright, I managed to get sufficient angle against whatever shot at me there to get auto bounce. Probably one of the guys back here. The further towards the side, so the Conqueror and the Tirpitz can probably actually pen me. Did manage to dodge out some torpedoes by ranging them out, looks like. There's a pair of enemy Tirpitz trying to round the corner. Now, because the Tirpitz is a battleship, gun caliber becomes very important, not for fire starting or alpha purposes, although these are still relevant to a lesser extent. Can pop my heel as I'm taking fire here from 3 ships, but because of the overmatch mechanic. Now starting at tier 8, you start seeing cruisers which have a 27mm bow, so these would be the Baltimore, the Eugen, and the Hipper. And the problem with 27mm bow is that 27mm bow actually bounces 380mm AP, which means you cannot punch through their bows if they go bow in. If a Baltimore or a more likely a Hipper or Eugen decides to rush you, if they're bow pointed perfectly in, you have no recourse other than to shoot your AP into their superstructure. Now if you were a British battleship such as the Monarch, which also has 380mm in terms for its gun caliber, but does have British HE, this wouldn't be a problem. However, German HE is pretty horrible. It has low alpha. You can see the fire prevention helping me out there from the sustained HE pressure. The German HE, as I was saying though, has low alpha and low fire chance for a battleship caliber shell. Now the Tirpitz does have pretty decent reload, 26 seconds. You can see there my torpedo tube on the side I'm taking fire on has been destroyed, fortunately. The torpedo tubes are pretty fragile. I'm going to take a pop shot on that Tirpitz. So yeah, pretty bad HE overall. It does have the advantage of having quarter pen, but quarter pen on battleship caliber HE is rarely relevant unless you happen to be shooting at a Midway or Hakuryu armored deck or something along those lines, or Stalingrad, those kinds of heavily armored cruisers. So angled Tirpitz there, no choice but to shoot into his superstructure. Fortunately for me, German battleships do have a fair amount of superstructure. That applies to myself as well, of course, so you do take a fair amount of normal penetration damage, angled or not, against competent opponents who do know how to aim. Now you'll notice I basically was just forced all the way north to the kite, even though I'm a brawling battleship. There's no way I'm going to be going in against 3-4 enemy ships. It's definitely some over-aggression. Now that Worcester is harassing me from range, because he's a Worcester. That enemy Tirpitz that made that turn in front of my team, obviously I made a mistake. You can't afford to show that much side, especially against the Yamato. All the enemy battleships that pushed into the concave of my team were burned down, so secondary spec or not, don't do anything suicidal. 2 million tanked, says Mr. Lube. What an amusing name. Who is this guy? The Yamato. Well, I myself have 1-6, so not bad myself. I do wish I had my spotter plane up. You can choose to equip spotter plane, especially for ranked competitive modes. Spotter plane, not so useful for extending the range. 21.4 is still already pretty good base range for a tier 8 battleship, but it is more useful for changing your perspective and raising your vantage points. Sorry about that. Beached Jean Bar, shoot for the superstructure, he's angled, and because I'm in cover, I managed to shoot undetected. Now speed-wise, just like her sister the Bismarck, the Tirpitz does do a respectable 30.5 knots. She's just a hair faster than her sister. So in that regard, she keeps up well, even in high-tier games. It's just the torpedoes, which have a 6-kilometer range, as well as a good armor scheme. She's covered in 40mm strips at the bow, just behind the 32mm bow that's shared by all high-tier battleships. She has some thicker 40mm strips. Gonna take a shot at this booster. It's reversing. And then the middle deck is actually 40mm, which is pretty good. 40mm is a relevant caliber because 40 resists 203mm HE, as well as Bayard 152 and IFHE on regular 152s. The Bayard is a pretty unique new French premium. She's a light cruiser with 152s, but she has 1/5 pen instead of the typical 1/6 pen. Gonna take a blind shot at the Aiden. I can't exactly see his citadel height, so I'm likely to get overpens there. And this poses a problem for the normally tanky North Carolina, Alabama, Massachusetts, and other such American battleships, because normally they're fairly squishy to HE, but they do resist HE because on their middle section, because they have a 38mm middle section. This is common to the Missouri, Montana, and Iowa as well, and the Georgia now. But the Bayard, with her 152s and 1/5 pen, is able to resist. Let's see if I can finish her. Is able to penetrate through 38mm of armor. Her 152s with IFHE and 1/5 pen give her enough penetration power to punch through 38mm, which means in the ClanWars context, those American battleships do get farmed by the Bayard if a team decides to field it. Now, the Bayard currently is not a particularly common ship, mainly because she's newly released, and so you have to be a bit of a whale to acquire her, but it is something to keep note of. The Germans, along with the Vladivostok and Lenin, do manage to resist Bayard HE because of their 40mm middle section. Now you saw there when I tried to finish off the booster at a good 15 kilometers, I was not able to land the shots. The shots were probably aimed decently well, but unfortunately, thanks to my poor accuracy, I was not able to land the shots. Now only now, it's my first time actually having something in secondary range. He bounces the shell off my belt. He should die here to my teammates even if I don't hit him though. Now I'm playing very conservatively, pushing at the back, being more tanky than damaging, kind of the same way you play the tier 9 Frederic de Grossa. I want to get my damage in over the course of the game by being absurdly tanky, not necessarily by shoving in immediately and making use of my close range characteristics. Now remember, I'm missing my torpedo tube on this side due to my earlier kiting away. That's fine. My damage is pretty low. You'll find this happens quite a lot when you're bottom tier. You want to play conservatively, conserve your HP, and then your damage at range is not particularly excellent, so you end up with very tame games like this. However, should focus that guy. When you have rare treats pop up at 6 kilometers, you see the guns do behave. Full broadside, thinly armored cruiser. Obviously I'm gonna overmatch right through. Wasn't even overmatched there technically, just punching through the broadside belt. Now, John Bart. My back guns are ready, but they're also blocked off. My front guns, however, should be able to fire. Okay, and just managed to squeak the shells over. Unfortunately, he did accelerate, so it looks like just 3 overpens through his butt. That's fine. So this is Zhao over here, who is creeping away. Since he's creeping away, he's likely to have been kiting away, and that means he probably launches Stinger torps. So as I cross this corner, even though I'm giving a little bit of broadside to get my guns to bear at anything that might be there, I do need to be ready to turn hard right. Fortunately, I have a great meat shield in this Massachusetts in front of me to block any incoming torps. I'm gonna slow to make sure he blocks for me, and I want that Minotaur. Fuck the Jean Bar. Focusing with my secondaries. Pretty decent salvo on the Minotaur. A bit of spray as he moves this way, so I didn't get quite a perfect salvo on him. That's fine. Focusing my secondaries onto the JB, who appears to have beached himself, looking for I'm kind of blind here, so looking just for superstructure. These torps, there's a lot of them. From the spread, there's 2 spreads of quints here. Let's see if I can dodge them. I don't think I can. I'm fairly large. Okay, I'm lucky enough to thread them. Based on the spread in the direction, they're probably just Minotaurs. He's just outside my 9-4 secondary range. But because he's a Minotaur, I'm looking to overmatch him. Looks like he was reversing. I aimed right at his bow, but if he does accelerate, those shells should hit him. Okay, so they missed. You saw there, the German 380 has some pretty good shell velocity. So they moved across fairly quickly. It's just I aimed at the wrong spot. He was reversing, and I aimed in front of him, so obviously if he keeps reversing, they're gonna miss. That's his other side of torpedoes. You saw there he repositioned. Can't see the Minotaur right now, no vision support, so I'm gonna take a pot shot at the Zao. My allied Massachusetts goes down. He's quite a bit more vulnerable to the Minotaur than I am. Oh, there's a Shimakaze here. Didn't mention that, but I do need to be maneuvering. So I'm gonna give side. Just alter my direction. Keep in mind that there's a torpedo spamming destroyer there. I'm just looking for one overmatching shell. You can see there, pretty ugly dispersion, 14 kilometers. No hits. That's the unfortunate reality of German battleships. LOL, accurate battleships, what are those? He's turning to torp me now that I'm talking about the Minotaur. That's fine. My secondaries already had him selected. My rifles will load. Only gonna go for the 2 because he's so low, and you saw a nice 4-kilometer miss. Nothing I can do about that, however, so I'm gonna bow in the torps, pop my heel, just to get the most out of my heel in case he does torp, so I knew that. So I did manage to dodge the torps, which were apparently not meant for me. Chose to torp the Yamato, that is perfectly fine. Now someone's paying RPF on the Shimakaze, but I'm a Bismarck. I have no business chasing a Shimakaze. If I was my sister, the Bismarck, and had hydroacoustic search, then I could consider shoving in and escorting my Yamato. But as is, as a battleship captain, knowing that there's a Shimakaze out on the prowl, the play is to push away from the Shimakaze. Now I preempted my turn. I am going to take probably 1 or 2 of these. Nevertheless, because I'm too clumsy, you can see there the devastating Shimakaze torps. Might be too fat here. Looks like I'm too fat. That's unfortunate. Bit too thick. You gotta think about where the Shimakaze is. Maybe should have turned a little earlier. I was, of course, responding to the Yamato, or not the Yamato, but the Minotaur though, so I did end up turning in. But that's fine. My team will clean this up. Yamato pushes north, just like I was attempting to do. Into C cap, Yoshino takes B cap, and the game is elementary. So the Yoshino is saying he's not detected. Yoshino has an 11.3 detection range, so that's about 2 squares. Each square is 5 kilometers, so he's not inside this circle roughly. Yamato, yep, continue pushing north. You saw there the rather sluggish handling of the Tirpitz. She's a pretty large ship. Her rudder ship is actually quite decent for a Tier 8 battleship. Not as good as a North Carolina or Alabama, but definitely better than her tier mates such as the Amagi and Key. The Vladivostok is pretty sluggish too. Lenin is also pretty average. Gascon, Richelieu also are nothing to write home about. But you saw there, in terms of this game, 43 main battery hits. You don't tend to get a lot of those. Only 31 secondaries because it's a bottom tier game. Since I'm bottom tier, I don't shove in, so I don't get to make use of my excellent secondary set. Not Massachusetts level excellent, but pretty decent. Nevertheless, 2 fires, obvious from some secondaries, assisted capture, 2 citadels. So the German 15-inch, or 380mm gun is still, it's a low shell weight 15-inch shell. It's a light shell, but it's still pretty high velocity, and it doesn't have too much air drag. But it is a light shell, so it lacks penetration power compared to some of the other shells in her tier. The American 406, for example, is a super heavy shell, so it has a nice slow plunging fire, but that gives it a metric fuck ton of penetrating power. And then the Amagi Key's 410mm shell is just a much larger shell, which has high velocity and larger size, so that too has more penetrating power. The French 380mm is a heavier 380mm shell, so that as well has more penetrating power. You can see even on the Alsace at tier 9, which is still using the 380mm shell, it's a big, heavy shell. So overall, the Tirpitz has a firepower and durability set more geared towards tanking and durability rather than firepower. The firepower is inconsistent and relatively short-ranged. You saw from the missed salvo at 3 kilometers on a Minotaur. Shells spray everywhere. Now, overall in terms of performance, 96,000 damage. I went over all the ribbons. Team score-wise, just for tanking my way through the game at bottom tier, 1800. So, not exactly the most impressive game, but nothing to be disappointed in. Plenty of tier 10s below me, and by playing conservatively, I was able to survive through most of the game until I finally caught the shimmy torps, which were pretty undodgeable given I didn't know it precisely the angle, and I had to make a turn into them first before I turned back out when I was fighting the Minotaur. Now damage-wise, you see even though I'm hybrid secondary spec because of the range at which you play at high tier maps, most of my damage came from the main battery. When the secondary battery did fire on the Minotaur though, it did a decent amount of damage along with the fires. Damage-wise, in terms of targets, you can damage pretty much anything. If DDs do stray into your secondary range, the secondaries are really good at chewing them up. The secondaries also have enough penetrating power to deal with cruisers, especially thinly armored cruisers like the British ones. And then a bunch of battleship damage, that's all main battery damage. Tanking-wise, you'll see, while we did burn and take a lot of HE pens, most of your damage is going to come from AP pen damage. Because the Tirpitz has so much superstructure, she does tend to take a lot of damage into the superstructure. Now going back to port, I'll show off my captain first. This is not a 19-point captain, even though this is my shared Bismarck captain, so this is my preferred Bismarck spec. I take priority target. This is to know how much pressure you're taking, and also for the torpedo warning indicator. When people switch onto torpedoes from their main battery or destroyer, it'll flicker the number. So it'll drop down 1 and then go back up to 1. If there's only one destroyer, take Adrenaline Rush. The German 380mm gun is pretty fast rotating, so you don't need it per se. You can go back for it later if you feel the need. Now for my 3-pointer, as I've iterated in several of my other incomplete battleship builds that are a bit hybrid spec, I prefer basic stuff survivability on my secondary spec battleships. So there are 4 real options for any secondary spec battleship. There's Superintendent, which is the safest all-rounder. All battleships have a heal. Getting an extra heal is always good. And if you have any other extra consumables, such as the German Bismarck's Hydro, that gives you an extra Hydro step. Taking basics of survivability reduces fires and floods. When you're in a big battleship, especially one like a German, you're almost always going to get set on fire or flood over the course of the game, so if you have to let some tick when your damage control is down, this reduces the amount of damage you take. The 2 less conservative choices are Demo Expert and BFT. So BFT obviously just gives you 10% extra firing on all your secondaries. However, as you noticed during the course of the game, the secondaries don't go off that frequently, especially when you don't take AFT. It does also add 10% continuous AA damage. However, as a German battleship, the Tirpitz's AA is pretty piss poor. 35 damage per second on your secondary aura isn't exactly what you want to be doing at tier 8. Even the short range only does 385. Long range does 193. The Bismarck is a little better. Her big sister Bismarck is a little better, but not much better. Now for your 4th pointer, you don't, like I said, you don't actually need the secondaries at first, so I would recommend just going fire prevention first. But once you do get fire prevention, do take manual secondaries. This allows your secondaries to actually be a threat rather than just an irritant. So that's 14 points. Now as for how you spec the rest of the way, there's a lot of variety. You can go back for AFT. I'm not going to go back for AFT personally because I think the extra range is not that relevant because of how inaccurate secondaries are even with manual secondaries. I find that at 11.3 kilometers of range, which the AFT gives you, the increase in damage isn't particularly impressive. It's just a fireworks show, really. And then the extra flak puffs is not great, or the extra flak damage is not great. Now with the new system where flak is going to be even more emphasized, maybe AFT becomes a better choice, but for now, not great. You could also, of course, go for the very conservative choice of concealment, and you end up with a very hybridized build, just a standard battleship build, probably missing superintendent, so that you can take manual secondaries. You can also go back for another one of the 3 pointers we skipped. So if I were to go back for one, I'd probably take superintendent. There is some argument for taking BFT for a nice all-rounder AA and secondary skill, but because I want my extra heal, extra fighter, and on the Bismarck extra hydro, I'll probably go back for superintendent if I take a 3-pointer. And then if I take a 3-pointer, I go back for expert marksman. Or high alert, or jack of all trades. Jack of all trades is like a pretty mediocre skill, but it has its uses. And then high alert is high alert. Nice to get a better dam con. If you go for a 4-pointer such as AFT or concealment, or maybe even RPF if you're some insane monkey, then you get 1 point to spare. So with 1 point, probably preventative maintenance. You saw there I lost one of my torpedo tubes. Preventative maintenance does help keep torpedo tubes from becoming incapacitated, which it can be critical when you're getting up close and brawling, if you get into a brawling situation. Alternatively, you can just take an extra fighter for random battles. So you can take 1 and 4 or 2 and 3. You could also take 2-2-1 in theory, I suppose, but superintendent is probably better than 2-2-1. Module-wise, just going over. Slot 1, MBM 1. Slot 2. Yeah, looks like damage control is pretty straightforward. It's pretty much the only skill I would take. And then slot 3, there's some arguments here. So I'm hybrid build, so I take secondary range. So secondary battery modification 1. You can take aiming systems if you want to use a GK captain. I do use my GK captain, which is full tank. As you can see here, on occasion on my Tirpitz, but I don't bother with aiming systems. Because, unlike the GK, the Tirpitz only has 8 barrels as opposed to 12. Even taking aiming systems and getting that extra boost of 7% main battery dispersion doesn't help that much. Now slot 4 is a flexible slot. I take damage control system modification 2, which decreases, it's like basically a second basics of survivability. But there's an argument to be made for taking steering gears. So steering gears is good because you do get into a lot of close range brawls on certain maps and at certain stages of the game. And having the extra rudder shift when you're brawling helps you change your direction more easily. And so it can help their propulsion mod pretty bad. And then the last slot is concealment systems, pretty mandatory. Flag wise, just take your standard stuff. Secondary, heal, burn time. Everything else is optional. Speed is nice. If you want November Foxtrot, it's nice too. Detto flags are important for clan battles. Now, in terms of survivability, this is the big peak of the Tirpitz Bismarck. Now you'll notice the torpedo protection is pretty bad, 22%. It's pretty much the same as North Carolina, which has 23 or something. Actually, it might be 18. I think North Carolina is the lowest at the tier. But as you have a glut of hit points, 69,000 is pretty much the tankiest at tier. For comparison, if I show the Alabama, which is basically an NCAL, she has 63,000. If I show the Key, which is basically an Amagi, sorry I don't have many of the tech tree ships, the Key is similarly tanky. However, the Key has some other weaknesses, such as not having as good armor. So pretty much the tankiest tier 8 outside of the Vladivostok. And Lenin, the Vladivostok is pretty fucking busted though, at 73,000 and heavy armor, but she has damage control issues. But going back to just the Tirpitz, let's keep this focused, relatively speaking. Let's just look at the armor scheme. So as I was mentioning, Tirpitz is a tier 8 battleship, so she shares the tier 8 traits of having 32mm fore and aft ends. However, from there, her armor scheme differs from many of her tech tree tier mates, or many of her tier mates. She has a 50mm middle deck, and the middle deck is actually quite extensive, so it's 50, not 40, but whatever. So basically as thick as a Stalingrad in terms of middle deck. And 50mm middle deck resists essentially all non-battleship caliber HE that hits this deck. So any HE that hits this 50mm region, which you'll notice is quite a large region, is going to shatter. Now you have a big amount of superstructure, which is only 19mm, so any HE hitting that large superstructure is going to still pen you, but anything splashing on the borders is going to shatter. And unlike many battleships which have an upper casemate belt of uniform 32 as well, the Tirpitz has 160mm belt, and then a nice thick 315mm belt. And you'll notice here that this heavily armored section actually reaches quite far forward into the ship, right up to the front turret. So when you angle, even against Yamato AP, which can pen 32mm, if the shells just disperse a little too far off to the side, they easily bounce against this thick belt armor, which they can't overmatch, or this deck armor. So this armor scheme in general is what makes Tirpitz and her sister Bismarck so damn tanky when played properly. Of course, when you give full broadside like this, the thick armor has some disadvantages. Because it's so thick, you get less overpens. Sometimes when you punch into 32mm armor on the side, and you aim too high, or your dispersion sprays your shells too high on a ship, say like the Alabama, which has a 32mm upper deck, you'll get overpens rather than full pens. But with a thick belt like the Tirpitz, there's always enough armor to fuse AP shells, so you get full pens. And all this juicy 19mm superstructure, because there's that 50mm of armor underneath, you don't get too many overpens from enemy battleships shooting into the superstructure. Instead, it tends to punch right through the 19mm armor and then fuse on the 50mm deck underneath, and then that results in a lot of full penetration damage. So in general, the Tirpitz just takes a lot of damage, in spite of its big tanky armor scheme. The turtleback armor, as you can see here, this is the Citadel. It's waterline, so it's fairly accessible, very vulnerable. It's more vulnerable from range, however. Right above it is this German turtleback. You can see the shape here. And this turtleback of sloped armor, it's fairly thick, is what prevents the Tirpitz from taking Citadels at close range. At close range, battleship shells just slam into the turtleback and then they bounce off in ricochet, resulting in full pens but no Citadel hits, which is what makes the Tirpitz and Bismarck an excellent brawler. Anyhow, this was my in-depth overview of patch 0.8.6 Tirpitz. She suffered a lot, seen a lot of shit, but in the end, Tirpitz is still Tirpitz. A nice solid tier 8 premium, not exactly a top pick for competitive. Her sister edges her out with the Hydra, but still a fairly tanky choice for if you want to bring some kind of heavily armored pushing battleship. And there you have it. Cheers!